Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Probably Cancelled podcast in association with the Midwestern Marx Institute. My name is Bridget, and I'm your host. And today I am here with journalist, author, and lecturer Matthew Ehret. Matthew is the founder of the Canadian Patriot Review, director at the Rising Tide Foundation, and senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. He's here today to talk about a new trilogy of books that he recently published about the depths that secret societies and mystery cults have influenced Western politics and society overall for hundreds of years. This subject is right up my alley, so I'm super happy to have you here to talk about it today. How are you doing, Matt?
Hey, Bridget, I'm good. Thank you for having me back on again. I always have a lot of fun chatting about big ideas with you, so I'm sure this is going to be a pretty edifying experience, and I hope the viewers get something out of this.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Oh, yeah, I'm really excited for this particular episode. And you've been on the podcast a few times. This might be the fourth time, maybe the fifth time. But for my listeners who are not familiar with your work and what you do, could you please tell us about your work and also about this trilogy that you've recently published?
Sure. Yes. Well, I wear a few hats. I'm typically labeled as a journalist and a geopolitical analyst. So as such, I find myself often representing the Academy for International Cooperation and the American University in Moscow, where I've been working with Dr. Edward Lazansky for a little while now, and trying to avoid World War III and create a foundation for cooperation amongst nation states. So that's something that's been an ongoing project. Otherwise, I founded the Canadian Patriot Review back in 2012, and I still manage that as a geopolitical platform. And the Rising Tide Foundation is something I set up with my wife as a nonprofit a few years back, in order to provide a little bit more of a cultural, educational orientation. Since what we found over time is that a lot of people, they might like elements of what we say or not like elements of what we say, but there's something deeper about how people are thinking, not what they're thinking, that is really what needs to be addressed. So the cultural war is what we were feeling like we needed to start engaging with a little bit more. And since the Rising Tide Foundation deals a little bit more with that, and I've written some books. So, like you inferred, I just released a trilogy of books, but that's sort of a part of a continuity. So, the way I've sort of been organizing my thoughts and my research, it's helped to write a lot and to try to share my discoveries as I make them, as part of my capacity building. And somewhere along the way, I don't know, 2010 or something, I started that commitment, which has worked pretty well. So I've been able to do, I think, a fair bit of original research and just organize my mind pretty usefully, and it's manifested in um, trying to make sense of Canada and just untying a bunch of Gordian knots. So that project became the Untold History of Canada book series, a 4-volume book series that most of that work was done in 2012 to 2015, and that's available on my website. And then after that, I was like, okay, well, now that I've untangled what is Canada, um, I was like, well, let's try to map out the United States a bit more concretely as far as the clash of these two opposing paradigms embedded within U.S. history that you and I have talked about in past broadcasts. And that became increasingly over several years the Clash of the Two Americas 4-volume series. And then as a sort of the fifth volume in 2023, I published the Science Unshackled, sort of looking at the clash of the two scientific traditions going back to the days of Plato and the Platonic Academy in Athens, that was giving rise to many major discoveries in astrophysics, astromaritime navigation, as well as geopolitical consequences as far as the concept of creating a society organized around the notion of breaking the cycle outlined in Plato's Republic of societies that consistently collapse from democracy into anarchy, into tyranny, democracy, oligarchy, aristocracy, and then just do it all over again. So he outlines like several different phases of different types of society that transforms one into the other, and in the extreme cases, it's basically tyranny and mob rule. which tend to vacillate within a spectrum, that each one generates a certain type of individual that represents the spectrum, and that is one can't break out of unless you can resolve certain paradoxes he surgically implants within his texts, and I would say most of his dialogues, he surgically implants certain paradoxes that he challenges the reader to deal with and chew on without giving final crystallized answers. And it's in the solutions that he wants people to discover that are basically tied to what Confucius and Mencius also tapped into in China earlier, even before Plato, which is that it's only when you have a culture that can encourage people to love wisdom that you can either that the kings themselves become philosophers, or that the entire culture can generate philosopher kings, so that everybody can be considered sovereign because they love wisdom more than the other lower considerations of things below the belt, so that science of organizing society that Plato put forth in his Republic, and that sort of animated most of Western history, I would say all of it, including what Confucius put out, and that animated Asian Chinese history, especially in the development of the Silk Road and things around Confucian meritocratic concepts. That's something that had a scientific basis to it. And so in that fifth volume, Science Unshackled, it sort of goes through in a bit more detail with some concrete case studies over 13 chapters, different battles within the realm of biology, biophysics, physics per se, earthquake forecasting, and what have you. So that sort of helped me sort of map certain ideas, that there's not just one thing called Western philosophy or Western science. There's two competing ideas, and only one of them generates the discoveries. The other one is a mimic. It's an oligarchical construct designed to, as Socrates called it, become wind eggs. So what we have is something that's marketed to students in school, that they're told is Western science, but it isn't. It's fakery. And usually when you scratch below the surface of a Isaac Newton, who we're told is sort of like a superhuman discoverer of everything in the universe, you start discovering that there are these weird Rosicrucian occult operations that he directly is a part of. And it's like that for many. John Locke as well is directly talking in many of his writings about a secret doctrine that he feels that he is a high priest of that he's referring to as far as Jesus's secret doctrine passed down orally to the inner initiates. And Peter Thiel talks about this when he's referencing John Locke and that tradition of the secret teaching order of the occult. So that's, again, not real science, but the fake stuff. And the real stuff is what is stolen, often plagiarized, and then reattributed to fake personas who are more controlled. So that was that book, and it was challenging, but I thought it was it put me in a position where I felt like now I needed to go to the next sort of phase of this mapping in my mind, which was the thing I've been sort of avoiding for a long time, which is the occult. And it's kind of everywhere. We see it on the dollar bill. We see evidence of obelisks all over the world, in New York and Washington and Rome. And, there's definitely occult underpinnings to a lot of big decisions. The Olympics in Paris recently was another blatant example of weird stuff. Unveiling the CERN, the CERN particle accelerator in Switzerland.
Yeah.
Huh? Yeah.
Hydro Collider.
Where it seems like there are certain people positioned in the scientific community who do seem to think, I'm not saying I believe it, but they believe it, that they're like opening some portal into some, I don't know, Gnostic, other dimension. So there's this weird stuff that is shaping our lives. And I figured, well, now I've felt like I had enough foundation to go there. And as I went there, as I began publishing my research, I realized that I found myself over a few months on sort of 3 different trails that I could feel were tied together, but I didn't exactly quite know how, but they were sort of converging on the same place, the same story, which was the counterculture movement and what created and orchestrated the baby boomer social engineering experiment that manifested big time in the Summer of Love. So all 3 were sort of moving there, and I realized somewhere along the way that I was like, I want to make this the book. but I realized that it wasn't just a book, and I had to figure out how to parse it out. And so what I did is I made it a trilogy. I decided about halfway through that this has got to be a trilogy, and sort of volume one, which is on Mystery Babylon and the Age of Aquarius, deals a little bit more with the geopolitical aspect of the mystery cults from ancient Babylon to the present, and the different incarnations or iterations that these cults sort of took on as they went underground in the 4th century, and what how a lot of these things have underpinned the Crusades, other things that we've taken for granted. And that's a little bit more material. So the material aspect. Volume 2 is the subversion of science with a focus on the occult. I alluded to Isaac Newton, but there's a variety of figures in the I called it Rosicrucian Golem as far as Volume 2, and that deals with the intellect and the battle over the intellectual domain. And on the cover, there's like Nikola Tesla, Isaac Newton, Tesla 2.0 in the form of Elon Musk, and Charles Darwin, who are all kind of play into this synthetic golem type operation that attributes discoveries or ideas that are, if when they are legitimate, from that were made by real engineers and scientists, that are then attributed to more controlled personas to advance an imperial agenda that subverts the actual potent creative scientific traditions that I was alluding to. And then the third one is called it deals with the spirit a little bit more. So it's called Edgar Poe's Final Mystery and Other Tales of Ratiocination, dealing a little bit more with the cultural battles. It brings in the battles of Beethoven, who was also, surprisingly enough, as I found out, battling a lot of these occult agencies inside of Vienna. That, yeah, there's a chapter on Beethoven's battles, as well as Mozart, who are part of these Republican networks in Vienna, battling against these Rosicrucian lodges that were trying to subvert Western civilization. That Edgar Poe picked up that tradition in his battle, which is embedded in a lot of his stories and poems and political fight more broadly. That then showcases a little bit more of the sickness of what is it that these, black mass engaging occultists who have taken over many of the lodges in Western civilization, the Freemasonic lodges, have largely been subverted. And so what do they believe in? What do they do? And I use the case study of Jack the Ripper to go through one of the occult rituals. And it was an occult ritual directly tied to the reconstruction of Solomon's Third Temple, which is a whole thing unto itself. And it's really weird.
What?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a lot of stuff I haven't even.
I know. I'm sorry, but
I haven't even heard of. But
yeah.
Well, I cracked open your books. I haven't been able to read all of them yet. I've been dabbling in the second one in particular because it's one of my favorite subjects. But I can tell you, the footnotes go crazy in these books. Like these books are extremely detailed with everything you've been able to uncover. And it's very, very fascinating. And we could go so many different directions in talking about what you've collected for us. But just to start out, could you kind of describe like what even is a secret society or a mystery school? Like what even is that? Because I think a lot of my listeners wouldn't even know what that actually means. And I mean, online you'll see a lot of people claim a lot of different things. But so what's your take on what a secret society is?
Oh, okay. Well, I guess in its most general definition, I'm going to be super neutral in general here. It's without putting any moral tinge to it. It's any type of group that wants to keep secrets. And in the types of groups that I focus on, I'm more interested in those that have initiatory practices into esoteric Gnostic experiences like gnosis, which means types of knowledge devoid of reason. So the type of knowledge that one can only experience by going through certain types of altered states, disembodied experience, like experiences that give one the feeling of having knowledge without the actual mind work of earning the knowledge, and that are organized in ways that have an outward exoteric and an inner esoteric belief structure, one for the inner initiates, and one for the outer underinitiated or non-initiated to believe in. So a similar text might be adopted, but only one group who's gone through the experiences that are programmed for them to move up from a lower to a higher degree, as in the case of a lot of those mystery schools that I refer to, going back to the times of ancient Rome and Greece, and Persia. There was typically about 7 or 8 admitted degrees of gates or degrees of initiation. And so usually for those who would climb higher up, they would be able to look at those texts that happen to be affiliated with that school with a different filter that would pull out different lessons, either that would interpret allegorical imagery in a way that only an inner elite could firmly know, or that could pull out codes. So there was often the use of ciphers. They're big in ciphers, that, like, you see this with the Bible code and other things, or the Kabbalah, where you could look at, like, there's different ciphers that might take every 30-second letter from a certain text, and then you pull out those letters, and then you maybe have a different coding filtration system that gives you a different message. Aleister Crowley was big on that, those sorts of things, as were every Rosicrucian's huge on that. And that's not a new thing. Even though the Rosicrucian revival happened in the 19th century, it was just sort of a reiteration of something that had been already underway nonstop since the ancient times. So, yeah, that's how I would define sort of mystery school, secret society in that sense. And again, in its pure sense, secret societies are not intrinsically bad or good. Sometimes you need to, in the reality of, in realpolitik, when you're fighting to achieve a certain idea that you might share with a few other people that may not be broadly understood, but it might be a good idea. You might need to keep secrecy because you know that if you lay all your cards out openly, you will be subverted by those who would like to otherwise have their own ideas dominate. Let's say you don't believe in a master-slave type of organization of society, but those hereditary families and the associated power structures and banking operations that do believe in that type of society will do everything possible to make sure that your ideas fail. So you might want to use secret lodges, like as Benjamin Franklin did, and many of the founding fathers had to operate by necessity through certain secret societies. They might use ciphers, encryption in order to pass on messages with the least chance of them being intercepted along the way.
Yeah.
So that's part of life, and so, like I said, it's not intrinsically bad or intrinsically good, but it depends upon these other factors that determine whether it's good or bad. And the question of gnosis, whether it's built upon a society founded upon a love of the idea of breaking free of a master slave structure, or one that's committed to maintaining a master slave structure, is a big one that determines whether they're going to be good or bad.
So from my understanding is that for thousands of years, these secret societies typically were reserved for the ruling elite, or at least the highly learned, like the very few people within a society who had access and money to be able to learn to read. For example, most of society didn't even know how to read. So how are they going to be in a secret society learning, reading all these manuscripts and discussing them at high levels? Most people didn't even have the time to do something like that, in the ancient world.
Yeah.
So in my understanding, this has always been like a very, very elite level thing to be able to have access to. Is that correct? Or even, for example, I don't know what your feelings are about the Catholic Church, but there's like the esoteric and exoteric knowledge of the Catholic Church, for example, where the initiated, the priests, the people within the church had all of the knowledge to a very, very deep level. They're even collecting codices from thousands of years previously that who even knows what they have in their library. I would really like to know what's in the Vatican
Yeah,
library.
yeah,
But the masses of people who can't even read their Bibles, they're relying on the priests and the Pope to relay this sacred information to them. Right? There's the secret club that knows all of the things, and then there's the plebs who are relying on essentially
yeah,
their masters, so to speak.
yeah.
So that's my view of it. Would you agree to that, or do you have any nuance there?
Yeah, I would agree, and I would have nuance too. Yeah, so I would say it seems as though in looking at practices like the Eleusinian mysteries, which were very big in the ancient world, and even like all of the dominant cults that were at war with the early Christian church, like early Christian, like those primary dominant cults that I focused on were the cults in Rome of Isis, Serapis, um, Cybele Atis was the other cult, sort of a Earth Mother cult, and the other one was Mithra, the cult of Mithra, which was more for the Praetorian Guard and the elite, the warrior class. All of them, they weren't mutually exclusive, except that Mithra was for men only, so that was exclusive for men.
Mm.
Although there were homosexual practices for what has been gathered in the discovered. There's like 400 Mithraeum, these underground temples, and there have been archaeologists who have been able to piece together certain elements of their beliefs and practices, though there have been no surviving texts per se.
Mm-hmm.
On the I think the second or the third degree, there was homosexual relations that were part of it, part of the initiatory process. Now, you could also participate in the Sibyl Attis um, commune or communion as well if you wanted to. You didn't have to just do one or the other. You could also go to the Temple of Isis and worship there. Diana was another variation of the Earth Mother. There's different variations of the same thing. Gaia being
Mm-hmm.
another version of it. Um, Mithra being a solar deity, very much tied to Helios, Apollo. Also, earlier iterations were like Marduk of Babylon, the lead god of the Babylonian pantheon was the solar deity Marduk. That kind of like um, a, every time the priesthood ends up introducing itself into or infiltrating another geopolitical area, which has a different culture, they have to sort of retool their gods to cater to the aesthetics of and
Mm-hmm.
sensibilities of that target audience. So a lot of people get intimidated by
Right.
like plethora of gods, but there really aren't that many. Like there's many names, but there's really these core simple archetypes. Um,
Yeah.
they all kind of overlap, and all of them were involved with practices of the Eleusinian mysteries, which are being revived in our current day today. Graham Hancock, and there's many Brian Brewer Rescue and Diane Palsuka, and there's many influencers, Joe Rogan. They're all promoting a revival of the Eleusinian mysteries, which were also practiced amongst the various Gnostic groups as well of the second, third centuries. And so one thing that I've noticed throughout because the Eleusinian mysteries, Eleusis was a place in Greece, not that far removed from the Temple of Delphi or the cult of Apollo at Delphi. It's not too far from that. And people would go in pilgrimage and they would go through their transformative experiences, very secretive. Um, and they weren't reserved simply for the inner elite. You could be a slave and be a member, go and be
Mm.
initiated. Um,
Okay.
Now, I would say you're right in the sense that if you wanted to go to the higher degrees of initiation,
Mm-hmm.
uh, yeah, that's reserved for only the upper crust families for sure. But
Mm-hmm.
everybody was expected to be to the lowest rungs of society. Everyone was expected to be initiated to the first degree at least for the masses.
Mm.
And that would
Right.
involve certain types of cultural practices that would normalize watching or participating in various forms of sexual license while you were in certain environments. They would be like the playthings, the sexual playthings for the elites, oftentimes. I think would be how many of the slaves would be able to participate in that, or maybe amongst themselves. It was encouraged to have a certain kind of like what you saw with what was done to the baby boomers in the '60s. Kind of like everyone is expected to be
Mm-hmm.
part of that initiation process. If you were under 30 in the 60s, you were expected to pay homage, get your little like communion of LSD
Yeah,
while you're at
your
Woodstock.
midsummer Beltane festival, where everyone's just fucking with the bunnies in the woods.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. But then yeah, if you want to like rise higher up, then that would you have to either be exceptionally talented and selected and groomed if you were from a lower crust family because they saw like there was talent
Mm,
that could be useful, or but generally you would have had to have already been from a higher family, a la Skull and Bones types, where you're tapped on the shoulder and you know that you're going to have a bit more of an easier experience. Although it's still you're going to be your humanity is going to be groomed out of you, so it's not like it's a great experience either. I don't think so. Yeah, that's how I would see it on that point. Everyone's expected to
okay,
be a part of it, but only the elites are allowed to know what the esoteric game actually is.
right, okay. That's a good thing to note. And you touched on this for a moment before, but whenever I bring up the fact that the ruling class, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them do dabble in the occult and they have for a very long time. I have a lot of people say to me, that stuff's not real. How can you possibly believe that? None of that's real. It doesn't matter. And in my view, it doesn't even matter whether I believe in it or not. What matters is that these ruling class people, they believe in it. And we know for hundreds of years, for example, the British royal family, they had John Dee, who was like the high magician who worked with them for years in
Mm-hmm.
basically like a consultant. We had the the Tsar Nicholas and his family in Russia who were working with Rasputin, this like crazed mystic figure, and he was working as their consultant. We had the Oracle at Delphi, who, as far as I know, the emperors would go to the Oracle, and the Oracle would tell them what they should do in a case of war, for example. Like the ruling
Yeah.
class is referring to these mystics and referring to these mystical traditions for them to navigate through the material world and make real life decisions that affect everyone. So, in my view, it doesn't matter whether or not I believe what they're doing is real. What matters is that they believe it. They
Absolutely.
believe in what they believe, and it has an impact in shaping the world. And I think that we should look at it. And so, I'm really glad that you've taken such a deep, deep look there. Because a lot of people they won't even bother, but it has this stuff has real world consequence, and that's
Yeah.
why I find it so fascinating.
Well, it jarred me. I don't know if it jarred how you felt or when you saw this originally, but back in I guess it was 2005 that I first encountered the infamous now Alex Jones video where he snuck into Bohemian Grove
Yes,
and
yeah,
filmed the
yeah.
sacrifice of care
The
at
cremation of
the
care.
cremation of care, yeah, and you had this giant statue of Moloch. Um, which I didn't know anything about that, and then when you start learning more about what was Bohemian Grove and who attends it, you're like, oh wow, this is what Henry Kissinger and George Bush Sr. and Zbigniew Brzezinski and all of these very
All of
very
them.
yeah significant power players that messed up the world so significantly, they're all engaged in that type of activity, and you're like, well, either that's just an extracurricular fetish that they have that has no regard or does not in any way play into the types of geopolitical disaster shows that they're putting into play in the real world, or it's very much connected. And yeah, I came to the conclusion pretty early on that it's very much connected, that type of crazy stuff and what they do when they're in the State Department or managing the creation of Islamic terrorism as a new weapon of the Pentagon, throughout the 80s to
Yeah,
the present. It's connected. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Oh, it definitely is. Yeah, there's. What do you think? Do you think during the cremation of care, do you think there's actually a person in there as like a real human sacrifice, or do you think it's just all an effigy? What
They
do you
say
think
they
about
say it's
that?
all an effigy, but I don't believe anything that they say. And I mean, if you're gonna have an actual statue of Moloch, um, and I mean, look, what was Moloch? Moloch was one of the most significant pagan deities of the ancient world, and you prayed to Moloch. It was everywhere. It's talked about in Leviticus, Chronicles, Kings 2. It's all over the Old Testament. The whole Old Testament, in my mind, as I've looked at it through these eyes, like these new eyes that I've honed over some years of research, I'm now seeing it as primarily a giant war against child sacrifice. I mean, the prophets of all of these books are completely going to war on the very widespread practice of the high priests that would oversee child sacrifice to Moloch and to Baal, and not just child sacrifice. It was all a wide spectrum, like the type of stuff we read about with Aztec mass sacrifices to appease the gods and have some sort of like a will over the gods. The greater the sacrifice, the greater the power you get from these demonic aeons, archons, whatever spin you want to give them. That type of thing. It wasn't just Aztecs. That was also being done in the ancient world. It seems that at least the oligarchy believes that Solomon was, and it says so in the Old Testament too, that Solomon for a period was worshiping to Moloch, which did involve sacrificing children, and it's pretty terrible, but it was normalized, and I think that in my readings now of enough of these occultists, including Aleister Crowley, who was very high up in the British oligarchy, he had direct connections to high level families, and was a major player in political intelligence circles. He wasn't just a fringe occultist. He was doing serious, at this point, I don't think you can account for why the sinking of the Lusitania happened and how it happened in 1915 to get the U.S. enmeshed into World War I, if you don't specifically look at Aleister Crowley's role as a British double agent in America, in New York. And he was very much tied all the way up until World War II into high-level British intelligence circles. But him, Charles Warren, who oversaw the creation of Israel as a Zionist state, that same Charles Warren directly wrote in their writings their belief that the mass sacrifice practices of the ancient world that they believe was happening at the Dome of the Rock, which is today's Al-Aqsa Mosque. They believe that was a mass sacrifice zone, and that the blood of the sacrifice victims would be sent out into the adjacent area around Jerusalem or Palestine. And that was part of the organization of society around a blood and soil sort of identity. That's what they believe in. These groups that have been trying to revive the reconstruction of Solomon's temple. So they've got a very different idea of Solomon than the one that most non-initiated people who think that they're Jewish or Christian have of a Solomon who's a very sympathetic character that they read from in the Bible. The oligarchy has a very different idea of Solomon that's written in like the grimoire of the Testament of Solomon, which seems to be like this proto-Rosicrucian grimoire of the 13th century that they take very seriously, where Solomon is a necromancer, who can harness the power of Beelzebub and the demons that built
talk to
his
the
first
demons, talk to the angels and all the sigils and stuff. I mean, the British royal family were super into this. Probably are still super into that stuff.
Probably,
and the French royals too.
Yeah, the House of Bourbon. That's the other thing, right? So that gets at the other point you brought up with the Catholic Church. I think the most virulent branches of the esoteric, like I would say self-identified Satanists acting like Christians that have been active throughout the last 2,000 years, especially the last 1,000 years, have taken the form of two orders which seem to have an esoteric and an exoteric form to them, which is the Knights of Malta and the Knights Templar. So, or as they were originally called, the Knights of Malta were originally called the Knights Hospitaller. Both of them with the Templars set up around the same time, just around the First Crusade. And one of them sort of embodied, because one of the formulas for creating these cults and choosing what type of branding each one, because they're not always the same thing. They don't always look the same. The form changes outwardly over time. Like the Templars got taken down in the 14th century. They got burnt at the stake and banned, but they didn't disappear, right? They just took on a new form. The way that I've noticed in mapping these things out that they never just create one cult at a time. They don't just rebrand one at a time. They always create generally twos. and one tends to exemplify a feminine principle of organizing, and the other one a masculine principle.
That's
So
interesting.
yeah, like for example, the cult of Mithra is supposed to embody in its organizational structure the masculine energy of penetration power. So that's why the Praetorian Guard, the warrior class, were expected to be initiated into it, and you wouldn't really rise in the ranks of the Roman legions if you were not initiated. And that, that you're supposed to be thus this like crusader, go out chase monsters to destroy, and a very romantic fanaticism would beset the mind of the initiate, which at some point becomes evil. I don't know exactly what's done along that journey. But so that would be the masculine energy of penetration, and then the cult of the cult that would play off it. And these temples are often found with the Mithraeum in archaeological digs. They found a conjunction geographically of Mithraeum underground, which is sort of seen as, it seems, the womb of Gaia. That's where they would pray. So it's still kind of like an Earth Mother thing, even though it's only for men. And the temple of Cybele would be usually very close, either on top of or adjacent. And sometimes there's been churches. The church of San Rael is one of the churches in Spain that has been built on top of these Mithraeum. And there's a lot of Mithraeums that have churches built on top of them, and I think that's by design. Now the Cybele Attis temples would utilize primarily the feminine energy, which the oligarchy, they tend to define it as like the energy of sensuality, of intuition, of so it'd be a little bit more. You'd have like holy priests or holy what do you call it now? Holy prostitutes. So the temple would have
Vestal
their
virgins.
Vestal virgins, yeah, temple prostitutes, things like that. And so in Christianity, when Christianity became dominant, especially after the Council of Nicaea, there was not a lot of space for the type of practices that one would experience at the Temple of Isis and the Vestal virgins and the sacred prostitutes openly. They had to kind of like go underground a little bit. Like they had to, but it was still an important part of their organizing themselves and organizing society. So they had to, on the one hand, they created sort of the sacred nuns, which was done under the Benedictine order in around 520, which is when you had Saint Benedict and his twin sister, two members of the high patrician class of Rome, who all of a sudden had a sacred sort of life-altering experience in a cave, which is where they always do things. Go into a cave, have a life-altering, altered state, come out of it with a new mission, and they basically initiated the order. Scholastica was his twin sister. She created the Order of Sacred Nuns for the first time, it seems, as an order, and they worked together. And that seems to have been like one of the dominant conduits was the Benedictine order of hyper ascetics that generated this like Kantian, whip yourself if you have a bad thought practice for the non-initiated, and then for the inner initiated, well, that's where you would have like little soirees with the nuns and vice versa. That became sort of the proto witch covens, it seems, so practicing black mass a few centuries later. So the Benedictines created both the Templar order and the Knights Hospitallers. So when the time was ripe to finally unleash the Crusades as a forever war of religions, it was these two orders that were created to oversee and manage that forever war, along with another order that was nominally Muslim, but I think also I know, absolutely satanic, but acting Muslim in the form of the Assassins, the Hashashins, sorry, which are this knighthood, this Arabic knighthood built up in 1090 by Hassan I forget his name, Hassani Saba. And they would work together with the Templars, and they would take turns killing each other's enemies who were the enemies of either one. They were like people like Saladin, the peacemaker, who was always trying to figure out ways to broker peace with the Christian crusaders, right? Or a crusader Christian was actually trying to like broker a diplomatic peace arrangement with the Muslims, and every time that would happen, they would just be often killed. And there's a big list
Mm-hmm.
of assassinated people, and the Templars and the assassins, though nominally enemies, were always working together. And it seems like the Templars learned a lot from the assassins themselves, who were, it seems from my research, including this guy who's currently a major Ordo Templi Orientis figure today, still alive, James Wasserman. He wrote this Templars and the Assassins book. And in it, he's making a pretty persuasive case that it was the sect of mystics around the assassins who were guiding the Templars in their excavation of Solomon's temple, which they had their own, again, same mystical view. That was their home base as in Jerusalem when they were overseeing the Crusades. So again, just to make it clear, the Hospitallers became the Knights of Malta later on. They had a name change, but it was always the same thing, and it's still very dominant today. As far as its penetration of, like, look at every member of the SS. We're all members of the Knights of Malta. Every dominant leading member, Himmler, Goering, Galen. I don't know if Hitler was. He's probably too much of a tool to understand what anything was about there. But then the CIA, Allen Dulles, every single CIA director, vice director, head of office policy coordination are all members of the Knights of Malta. So that's the big penetration.
So wait,
yeah.
what does the Knights of Malta have to do with Malta? Are they from Malta?
Nah, they just had to go there. They bounced around a little bit. So in
It's
like
a random place.
yeah, well, I don't know if there's like deeper ancient occult significance to that location specifically. There might be, I don't know, but
I
it
know
was in
there's
15.
ancient temples there. Well, Malta has some of the oldest, most ancient temple ruins of the world.
Yeah.
And it's such a, I guess strategically the location of it is very interesting because it's right by Italy and Greece and like all these cultures in Spain, and they kind of converged there on this
Mm.
little island country.
Mm.
So yeah, sorry. I just was
No,
wondering
no,
what
that's a
the
good question.
significance of Malta would be, why they're named
Well,
that.
there's two aspects of that like two thoughts awoke in my mind as I was listening to you just now, which is that the logo, the emblem for the Knights of Malta is like a very specific kind of cross, right? People could probably just Google it and just see it for themselves. Now that particular type of, it's not really a cross. It's like a 4-sided X, or like 8-sided X even. And that emblem comes from Amalfi. So Amalfi is a little
Hmm.
city state that was a pseudo rival of Venice for some period. It was the origins of modern mercantile capitalism. In the I think it declared independence from the Byzantine Empire in like 825 or something like that. So Amalfi was very powerful. A lot of the leading patrician Roman families escaped to Venice and Amalfi when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and they reconstructed their system, including their system of pagan mystery cults at these locations. So for about 400 or 500 years, Amalfi, and that includes while the Knights Hospitaller were created, Amalfi was like one of the top central command centers of world geopolitics. And so hence the logo that we know today. Also, the Isle of Capri was in the possession of Amalfi for several centuries, and it was always under the ownership of the Benedictines. So as soon as Benedict created the order in like 525, he was immediately given by one of his devotees, this other high level patrician. He was given the Isle of Capri off the coast of Amalfi. So that's been a Benedictine hub. Now, Capri was also where Tiberius had his mass sacrifices, his worship to the cult of Apollo, and there's still Mithraeum there. There's still a temple of Cybele Attis there, and there's some real bad debauchery that Tiberius was engaged in. As that was his villa. There's been a lot of work in recent years to excavate his villa, and it's still today, as far as I could see, a major occult hub. Even certain players in the culture war today, like Jay-Z and Beyonce, have a vista right there at the Isle of Capri, and many others. But so the Knights of Malta got the name in 1530 they were given sort of a rebranding, and they base themselves now at that location, and that's been the case ever since. And it's a sovereign order, so it's called the Sovereign Order of the Knights of Malta and Rhodes, in Greece. And part of what they've been allowed to do for some reason is like they're kind of a country wherever they are. So they have their own passports. They're kind of above any type of national law. They got a representation at the UN as a sovereign nation, but it's like you're an
That's
order.
crazy.
Super
What?
weird. I know. And it seems like they seeded things like their grand strategists seeded things like the Opus Dei in the 1920s into Europe, and then embedded itself into the United States. And if anybody wants to know what the Opus Dei is, watch the Da Vinci Code or read the book Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. And even though it's fiction, Dan Brown appears to be operating within occult circles, and they're just sort of, they kind of just put it out there in some way. And I'm not saying it's all true, but it does. I think they do truthfully get across the essence of how Opus Dei has been used to play off of this underground Templar order, which are portrayed as the good guys in the book series,
Okay. Interesting.
that are carrying out the secret teachings of Jesus, who had his sacred prostitute Mary Magdalene, who he had babies with, and who seeded those babies, gave birth in southern France, that gave rise to various dynasties like the Merovingians, and that branched off to seed the various royal families. So part of it is that the royal families create sort of myths to justify their royalty, that their blood is just better. And so the myths that they create, I think they start believing in. So I don't know if any of them realize that the thing appears to have always been a giant like myth, like a lie created to justify political operations. But whether they believe it or not, like whether they know or not, they certainly advance this idea to this day that a lot of these royal families, including the royal family of England, which I think claims to have the biggest proportion of this Jesus blood that's been maintained by the Priory of Sion in secret, passed down through people who thus have like greater, I don't know, powers of clairvoyance and remote viewing, and greater powers of whatever. They're the starseed children
Royal
or whatever.
blood.
Royal
Yeah.
blood.
I never
Yeah.
read the Da Vinci Code, but I did go when I was in Scotland. I went to Roslin Chapel, which apparently is a chapel that features greatly in the book.
Yeah.
And that chapel it's absolutely incredible. But the carving in this chapel, it's like a Catholic chapel, but all of the meticulous stone carving, the masonry, has all these pagan symbols everywhere. It's like there's green men all in every corner peeking at you, like these small little green men carved into the stone, and Vesica Pisces, and like just flowers and vines on every single pillar. It's really spectacular, and that chapel was um, abandoned and forgotten about. I think it was owned by some kind of royal family, and then it was abandoned, and the earth took it back, and then it was rediscovered a few hundred years later. And there's a myth attached to it that is where Jesus brought Mary, or not Jesus, but after Jesus died, Mary Magdalene took a voyage through Europe and up into Scotland, and that's where she had like Jesus's babies. There's this whole mythology surrounding this pagan chapel. It's very interesting. So if you ever get the chance to go, I highly recommend it, because it is a sight to behold for sure.
Yeah, as
But
far
yeah,
as
I think they believe all this.
Yeah, as far as my evil centers of tourism that I'd like to check out, definitely be the catacombs under the Vatican, and maybe Venice, and Roslin Chapel. Yeah, for sure. Well, the other thing too about the Mary Magdalene, the esoteric Mary Magdalene, at least, which is different from the one that's officially in the New Testament, is that so the Templars have a patron saint, and it's Mary Magdalene. The Knights of Malta, or Knights Hospitaller, also had a patron saint that was Saint John. Now, I think from what I can gather as well in my research, They promote the idea that it's the character of John that you see in the Bible. It's the character of Mary Magdalene that you see in the Bible, but it's not. It seems to be, and even though we were told the story that the Nag Hammadi scriptures were discovered after World War II, when some dude, some Muslim kid was throwing rocks into a cave, or maybe it wasn't a Muslim kid, it might have been an older guy, named Muhammad Ali of all things, and he was like throwing rocks in, hurt a some clay break, and he's like, well, it's that, and then discovered like this giant repository of manuscripts. um I think that was staged. I think that the oligarchy has always known about
No.
these things. No, I'm saying that they're legit, like they're legit scripts. I'm just saying
Okay,
that they
okay.
were not secret, like they weren't something that we didn't know of but that was sort of their coming
Right?
out party. Yeah. So I
Okay,
think
okay. That
yeah.
makes so much sense because that story, when I heard the story of the discovery of the Nag Hammadi text, sorry to my listeners, this is such a niche subject, but this is like my favorite thing ever. The story of the two brothers who were, well, my version of the story that I heard of how these texts were discovered is that it was two brothers in Egypt who um, were basically like, looking for treasure in caves, which is actually not an uncommon thing to do, especially in the 1940s or whenever these texts were allegedly discovered. And they found these two clay pots with scrolls in them that they couldn't read. Like obviously this language is like, it was in Coptic, I think, and so but they ended up bringing these vessels home with them and neglecting them for a while, and then they discovered that their mother had been using, this is a story, their mother had been using these pieces of paper, the manuscripts within the jars, as fire kindling. So some of what they had discovered had been lost, but eventually they sold these manuscripts to, I think, like a British dealer for a museum or something, who then eventually had them translated, and they discovered that these are like missing passages of the Bible, allegedly, that were like closest existing discovered to the time that Jesus is said to have lived, right? So it's like
Mhm.
a extremely significant discovery. But that story always to me seemed totally like unbelievable, like an unbelievable
Yeah.
miracle of a story. So
Yeah.
your version makes a lot more sense, and I don't know why I never thought of that before, but
Yeah, like
I'm
uh
starting to believe you.
it's a hypothesis I have. It's not like I was there, right? But it's just for me, I feel like some of these stories that we're led to believe have to account for these major developments in history, like are often just, they just smell of fakery, like the discovery of the Illuminati, right? How the story that's been concocted is that it was just some letter courier who was like struck by a bolt of lightning, and then some villager in Germany found like this guy's letters, and some of them weren't burnt up, and they were like, oh, Adam Weishaupt and Cato, and like you have all of these like letters that became publicized when this dude was struck by lightning. And I just don't think that that's ever how. And then you actually read the letters, and they just sound like something. Some of these letters sound like something Pinky and the Brain would have like said, like as far as let's take over the world, and it's like over the top language, and in the type of
Yeah.
Grand
Well, it's like
Magus.
the protocols of Zion. Like I've looked at that
Yeah,
before to be like, what's this all about? And it reads totally absurd. Like it just like a caricature, right? Like
yeah.
there's no way this could possibly be real. But what do you think? So what do you think the purpose of revealing the Nag Hammadi text at that time? What do you think the purpose of that was?
Well, I think it was partially, and it had a lot to do with the Carl Jung Institute. Carl Jung oversaw a lot of that, and the first
Hmm.
translation and publications was through the Carl Jung Institute.
Hmm.
Um, I got the sense that it was part of the big occult coming out party, because part of the ambition of the elite, I don't hate that word, the oligarchy, has been to restore the ancient pagan mass sacrifice superstitions of the ancient pre-Christian world. They've been wanting to restore those things, like that's been, I think, one of the core ambitions, actually, beyond everything else,
Okay.
has
The
been that.
paganism, the pagan Jesus, the Gnostic Jesus,
Well, yeah,
who
like
was
like
in a
the
relationship with
idea
Mary.
Well, yeah, the idea that you have, like, when you read the Gospels of the Mary Magdalene, or the secret, the secret apocalypse of John, um, you have a sense that there is, yeah, like a very like a Christianized Kabbalism of like this oral secret knowledge that Jesus passed down to his preferred initiates. So the apostles are no longer apostles; they're now all of a sudden initiates, and some initiates are higher up than others. And so John and Mary become like the ones who received the true secret doctrine, which the others were too stupid to understand. So they were given the exoteric doctrines that were published in for the stupid people in the Gospels that were then canonized. But the secret doctrine, again, Kabbalism. What is that? It's just like the oral secret interpretation of Moses that he could only tell his preferred high initiates when he came down from the mountain. That were somehow different from the sort of edicts that were outlined in the Pentateuch of don't kill, don't steal, don't covet your neighbor's goods, and basic like codes of reasonable conduct in any type of ethical society.
Right.
That wasn't sufficient for the inner elect. They had a different moral code that they were allowed to know, but it was apparently too horrendous to actually write it down. So you had to be, prepared and initiated in order to understand it, and then passed down verbally. So it became very, very much a game of telephone at the end of the day. Very, very useful for geopolitical controls to have that level of just kind of like make it up as you go, like reinterpret what is really behind the coding of the Mosaic text or whatever else. So I got the sense that the Gnostic orders, which the Templars and the Knights of Malta were absolutely initiatory, and like Bernard de Clairvaux, who was the founder of the Templar, as well as the Cistercian, which are more radical Benedictines. He only had he's the only figure he was sanctified to turn into a cult figure. But when he's painted, he's the only person who was ever painted suckling on the tits of Mary Magdalene, who's like, he's always got his mouth out drinking from her sacred milk. And that's not normal in my mind. That's like super not normal. And they do seem to play with this mother, like this virgin immaculate idea of the mother Virgin Mary and the whore Mary. So the ambiguity of Mary they play with as an archetype as well.
Mm.
And I think in John too, like there's the secret apocalypse of John that outlines this sort of Gnostic creation story of Yaldabaoth that created the universe, who, in his evil image of ignorance, because he's the offshoot of this witch-like character Sophia, who is like the latest archon of the series of sexualized archons that are all having sex with each other to produce Sophia, and she just hates men so much, and she procreates with herself and produces Yaldabaoth and
Wait,
and
wait,
it's
wait,
this
wait,
discombobulated
wait,
story,
wait.
right?
Where is this? Where is this from? Because my understanding of Sophia is Old Testament, like
Well,
female
there's the good
aspect of
Sophia.
God, right?
Yeah, there's the good Sophia,
Okay,
like the reasonable Hellenic Sophia, and then there's this like this Gnostic Sophia that's in the Apocalypse of John, as well as, or the Secret Apocalypse of John, one of the Nag Hammadi texts, as well. There's a few others. I think Power, or was it Mind, Perfect
Thunder,
Thunder?
Perfect Mind.
Thunder, Perfect Mind also outlines this
Hmm.
story a little bit
Hmm.
of Yaldabaoth,
Which
I
is,
believe.
I love that poem, by the way. I think it's, I mean, it's, yeah. I mean, we can debate about this, but
Mm.
this poem, I don't know if my listeners even care about this. It's so fucking niche. But Thunder Perfect Mind is really interesting as a piece of literature that came out of the Nag Hammadi text unveiling. Is a poem from what seems to be from the perspective of the female aspect of God, but the entire long poem is all about dialectics. It's all about it's just all about addressing the opposites of the universe and the opposite of archetypes, and it's a very interesting poem. But not to interrupt you, I want to get your take on this. Um, if these gospels from the Nag Hammadi library are the oldest existing gospels that we know about closest to the time that Jesus was alive, wouldn't that make them more legitimate
It
in the
would.
realm of like Christianity?
It could, to the degree, but as far as I could tell, it seems like most of them were written in the second and third centuries. So I don't know if
Right.
they're actually they hold claim to be the earliest per se, but they definitely, if they were written in the second to third centuries, um, it just I just situate them as part of like a broader fight over like what would be how would we define this thing that's this new Jesus movement. Um,
Yeah.
and there's like a lot of dispute over like what the character of the thing was going to be.
Right.
Um, one of the things that I noticed about the oligarchy and their occult initiatory practices is this fusing of opposites. So one of the things that they really take very sacred, like very seriously, is a high priority, is the fusing together of moral opposites. So like put
Mhm.
your initiate into experiences that involve them taking the sacred and the profane and merging them together.
Mhm.
Take pleasure out of
It's
pain, merge it together,
the
take good into
demiurge,
it.
right?
Well, that's part of, yeah, like part of the way of breaking free of the demiurge's system of like, because part of the idea is that the demiurge created the universe, you know, in his image of ignorance and evil and all of the bitterness and ego that the demiurge suffered from, which is like the God of the Old Testament, pretty much as the initiate discovers. That was infused into all of creation, and so part of the idea is that the created world, our conscience, our traditional values, or the physical world is sort of a cage that's keeping us from actualizing the divine within. The divine within, that is that which preceded the demiurge's existence. And so to get back to that purity of the uh, of creating the apotheosis of the individual is you gotta do things that break you from the shackles of your conscience, of your traditional values that are seen as that which is preventing you from doing what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Um,
Hmm.
and in some cases, traditional values in society might be all corrupt and messed up that should be challenged. But in some cases, those values shouldn't are actually not are actually good, and you don't want to necessarily do that. But like I know in a lot, I don't know if all, but those that I've read that of those aspects of the Gnostic texts that they've been trying to promote are those parts that reemphasize the forcing together of moral opposites. That there's like
Hmm.
a higher, you know, oneness in taking again like the profane and the sacred and getting them together. Um, and I'm again, it's kind of a philosophically touchy subject for some, but um, I know that that's one of the things that has induced, like, for example, Aleister Crowley's doctrine of Thelema is, you know, again, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law is part of the idea of the Luciferian doctrine. And what they've been trying to do with the Sethian Gospels too is they take the archetype of Lucifer and they say that archetype of Lucifer that challenges us to, you know, uh,
Disobey our father.
disobey. Yeah, that finds like an avatar in the form of the secret Jesus, who had his secret doctrines that he would orally pass on to his lover Mary Magdalene or his favorite apostle. And but it wasn't really. It was kind of devoid of the type of moral lessons that you tend to get from the dude who kicked out the moneylenders or had these great, you know, moral lessons in the writings of Saint Paul or the original like official gospels. The All I know is the oligarchy is afraid of us doing good for its own sake because we love the good, and they want us to get confused over how to discern the good from the evil. And part of the way of doing that is again tying together like murder and sex, tying together and finding a way of like finding pleasure in doing both of those things increasingly.
Hmm.
Um,
And relativism, promoting relativism and subjective, like, ethical subjectivity.
Yeah,
I mean, I
yeah,
think that's like very popular, at least among my cohort, or millennials in America. Is like it's very much do what thou wilt
yeah,
ideology, and like you said, I think that really was pushed, especially during the 1960s with the hippie movement thing and the hallucinogenics and like reality subjective movement. It's like a
mm,
whole movement, right?
yeah,
Um, yeah, but also I don't know why I never realized it, but you have the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, and then you have Mary Magdalene, who growing up like with a Catholic family, I always heard that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. Later find out that there's no reference of her ever having been a prostitute in the Bible. This is
no.
like a whole other separate mythology that was created
Yeah, that
to.
was created the 16th century, by I think one of those periods where you had like, because more often than not, I think that Satanists acting like Christians were occupying the position of the throne of the Vatican more often than not. There were occasionally good popes, and you could see them usually because they get poisoned and they die.
Oh my god.
Typically, there's a big list, right? It's like American presidents. There's like a lot of American presidents who die while in office. Well, same thing. There's a lot of cardinals and especially a lot of popes who also die very convenient deaths because, and you look at what they're doing and you're like, oh, okay, they're trying to shut down the Jesuits. Oh, they're trying to actually uh, break the witch covens that have like taken over the black masses of Europe. And you're like, oh, okay, well, okay.
What's a
But
black mass? What is that?
it's like a center of satanic worship, like in what was it, in the Apennine Mountains. There's several zones which were central black mass centers in the medieval times, which was, I mean, it got revamped under the Rosicrucian revival of Edward Bulwer Lytton and Blavatsky's esoteric section, and then the Golden Dawn. They had their own like revamping of the Black Mass. It's basically just different types of sacred worshiping of Satan, and it usually involves different forms of opiates and psychedelic drugs and mushrooms and other things as part of a sacred and orgies. Probably a lot of human sacrifice, and I know in the case of Europe, what was it? It was in Monteverita. That's what Alice Bailey pointed out, who was a leader of the Theosophists in the 30s and 40s, and then sort of a pseudo enemy of Besant. She asserted that Monteverita in Ascona, which is sort of an occult center, um, was the one of the key places of the Black Mass of Central Europe in the medieval times, and the Apennine Mountains in Italy is another center of it. And even when you go to the official tourist website for the Apennine Mountains, where the alleged Apennine Sibyl, the 11th Sibyl of the ancient world, was located in the cave in the Apennines near Nursia, which actually Nursia is the nearest town to the Apennines, and that's the town that produced Benedict and Scholastica, his sister. That was another center, and it maintained itself as such. And they even take pride in the fact that that's where the persecuted Templars and Cathars went for sanctuary at their respective times. Um, so yeah, they take pride in that today. It seems to be a center where, like an occult creation center, where they would seed other subcovens and groups around Europe. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, it's a weird part of the story for sure. Um, but a lot of them would act Christian on the surface, but they would have this, again, this secret dark teaching below the surface. Um, so yeah, the idea that Mary Magdalene was a whore, that was just made official by some, I forget which pope in the early 16th century. Before that, there was nothing in the Bible to reference that. And I think it's because they believe that. That's part of the story. It's like Simon the Magi, Simon the magician, who was a major, I think a lot of the Kabbalist and Gnostic high priests like Valentinius and Basilides, that's him, and Marcian. They were followers of the doctrines of Simon the magician, Simon the sorcerer, who was sort of the first
Uh-huh.
of them. And he had Rachel, his sacred prostitute, and he was like touring Rome, saying that he was the new incarnation, the new avatar of Jesus, and this was his Sophia, and she actually was a girl that he pulled out of a brothel, and
Oh no.
it seems like they were actually doing some serious witchcraft and taking the communion very literally, like the eating of the flesh and the drinking of the blood, so that a lot of the Romans were horrified by the types of practices of this early pseudo-Christian sort of sorcerer figure who was acting like, yeah, he's the embodiment of Jesus's message. So it was feeding back into those who are utilizing people like Nero to persecute the Christians and burn them all, because they're like, look, it's a satanic, like they're eating babies, they're doing all of these, the shutting of the lamp, which was just the way to initiate the orgy. And they're like, we can't have this in Rome, and they started cracking down on Christians abroad, but it was because they were largely being fed this idea that Simon was the official Christian. So again, I look at a lot of the early, and the guy who's helped me a lot in sort of sorting this out is Saint Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyons, who wrote a book called Against Heresies, which is one of the best resources we have over the belief structure and the geopolitical aspect of the followers of Simon the Magician. And he lays it out pretty well, how Marcion and Valentinius, as well as Mani to a certain extent, who was the founder of the Manichaeans, which was its own weird hybrid of esoteric Zoroastrianism and Gnostic sort of Christianity. They created sort of these proto-theosophical smorgasbord religions, which Augustine later on, broke free of and called out for its fallacies of this like worship of light and darkness as two equal forces that we have to both pay homage to, of good and evil, both being equally good, and evil actually thus becomes good because the good only exists because evil exists. And so, well, if that's the case, then evil must be good. So to do true good, you have to do true evil, and that's the whole left hand, right hand path kind of like forms from that Manichaean cosmology. And St. Augustine also lays it out pretty well and showcases how this is a total fraud. But this is what's animating the Cathars. They're actually Manichaean. But the Templars, the Hospitallers, all these different mystery sects that became the Rosicrucians, they're all like very much Manichaean in that sense.
It's interesting that we have the good Mary and then the dark Mary, like the good Mary, the evil prostitute Mary. So I never even put that together. They have the same name. So that must have been by design when they decided to make the other Mary into a prostitute. I don't know. So how does this relate? Do you have time to go into? Sorry, I'm on a different time zone than you. Do you have time to go into how this has influenced like sciences, in particular in modern day, or should we save that for another episode? You have
I
time?
can talk about it now. I mean, this is obviously stuff we can keep on pulling on.
I know.
But yeah, we could totally still talk about that. I mean, yeah, I'm totally good to do this because I wrote 3 books and it's like kind of a passion. So for sure, if you want to keep talking about it, I'm more than happy to. Just today even. But yeah, the science thing, I guess so here, autobiographically speaking, I felt myself in a position, a relatively unique position to tackle this topic because I did a 10-year period as a volunteer with a Canadian branch of the Lyndon LaRouche organization from the age of 22, or maybe I was 23, until 2017. So until I was losing track here, maybe 30, 34 or something. No, yeah, 33,
I didn't know that
34.
about you.
Yeah, I did that for 10 years. Yeah. And it was a unique experience, a very unique experience. And it was one that I learned a lot because for me, that was I went through 2 years of just research of, how fucked up our world is, 9/11, international bankers. And you're like, oh, okay. At that point, I was like, all social contracts I thought I had with my society are off, null and void. It's all a lie. We're all being driven into a slaughterhouse. So I went to a hard depression in that process. And sort of part of my process of trying to get out was trying to think, okay, well, are there any, is there hope? Is there any viable fight against this thing? And so I was very enlivened when I encountered some of the policies originally of the LaRouche, of Lyndon LaRouche. And there was a small grouping of maybe 8 people, very tiny, in Montreal, in Canada, which is where I was working at the time. And so even though in my mind I was thinking, well, I don't agree with a lot of it. They're the only people who are trying to do something, and I was like, oh, let's help out. So I did that, and I was surprised over time to discover that there was this focus, and this is 2006, on classical educational curriculum that the younger members were encouraged to participate in. And I found myself, again, I was young, and this is something that the old man, he's dead now. He died in 2019. He's like 96, Lyndon LaRouche, and he'd been around the block. I mean, he's quite, but he had this emphasis on reading original source documents, and so part of the curriculum was like for 16 hours every weekend to work through systematically all of the writings of Plato, right, and then work through Platonic solids, try to build them up, play with them, like just try to play and figure out how a lot of the big discoveries of constructive geometry work. Try to do astronomy. So we'd have like astronomy sessions where we'd go out and try to actually do practical astronomy. And one of the points that the old man had made is that look for people who made discoveries and wrote down how they made discoveries, and then read their writings and see if you can replicate as much as possible the acts of thinking that they went through when they made their discoveries. So like Kepler, big guy, discovered 3 planetary universal laws, so he made his writings available, and they're available, and we read them, and we did like the work. And again, it was years of doing this, and you could sort of see after doing this enough that there was this continuity of method, that everybody who was making discoveries was utilizing a common method of analysis, which was outlined quite concretely in the Platonic dialogues of self-examining one's core axioms all the time, both intellectually, but also like in terms of the motives, but especially the axioms, and then generate paradoxes. So look for where the paradoxes of where your theories break down with reality. So when you press your theory onto reality because you want to resolve a paradox, you'll find cracks and those singularities where it doesn't fit is where you have to give all of your attention to. Those are the things that a lot of experts will ignore, because those cracks are what would prove that the thing that they've made a career on is broken, is not true, is fallacious. But that's where the discovery is. So a lot of like experts who get too into peer-reviewed practices, where you're just saying things to people who already kind of agree with you to be published and then to get grants and prestige, they unfortunately lose their creative, that youthful creative juice that they had when they were young. They kind of gets baked out of them as they get more like fitted into the system, and then they start seeing as a threat newer ideas, especially young people and students who pose difficult questions that might challenge the thing that they've made their money off of, and they'll get used to attacking. It almost becomes like a force unto itself. And so when I noticed, and you read Leibniz, the guy who was a follower of Kepler, who took Kepler's challenge up to discover a language that would allow humankind to describe nonlinear changes in physical geometries that were not just Euclidean mathematical entities, but real physical geometries that you find in the curvature of the universe, which is not, again, you can't take mathematical ideal Euclidean geometry and just impose it onto the universe. The universe, it's an approximation, but it's not ever going to fit. So like when you have, as Leibniz point, works on is hanging chains. They look like parabolas a lot, and lazy-minded people like Galileo will say it's a parabola, it's close enough, so we'll use parabolic functions to do the calculations on the hanging chain. But it's like, no, if you're honest, you'll notice that it's not a parabola. It's close, but it's not the same thing. It's a catenary. And Da Vinci's working on these things too, when he's taking like a catenary and then pulling it, or taking like a chain and then pulling it on a stick underwater, and you can see it dragging out a sort of a type of curvature, physical curvature, with the tractrix, which is then, it looks like a hyperbolic function, but it's not. It's something else. It's its own thing. And there's a language that Kepler was pressing on when he was looking at when he proved the elliptical nature of the orbits, that he could see was not perfectly describable by math, but he challenged future math scientists to come up with a way to develop a language, and Leibniz did that through his infinitesimal calculus. And so did Huygens, so did the Bernoulli brothers, and they're all looking at physical curvature in the universe, physical space-time, like what is the nature of it? How is it different from our mathematical entities? And so how does the mind of individual humans resonate with that infinite universalness of the universe, that our minds, when we make proper eurekas, when we break out of the limits of simple like deductive, inductive logic. So when we use deductive, inductive logic, it's fine to use those things, but to limit yourself to those things, you will never make a discovery. It needs something additional. And that eureka, that power of generating and that successful hypothesis that resolves the dissonance, which Kepler was excellent at, and Plato was excellent at shaping. That is something that I got experiences of that the more I was immersing myself in that classical humanist educational experience, which was otherwise impossible to acquire in the school system I was born into, because it's a shit society that's designed to make you stupid. So I was like, I cherished that. And I figured, as I found myself writing geopolitical analysis, I still had all of that bubbling. And I think it was probably useful for anything good that I've done in my geopolitical writings and trying to piece things together. I think that helped me a lot. That sensitivity that I know most people don't, they just haven't done the work to have that. So I was like, well, let's try to apply it now to this battle in science, which was the Science Unshackled book I was mentioning at the beginning that I published. And then in the case of, as I mentioned also at the beginning, when you look at Leibniz, you're like, or you look at Kepler, you're like, these people are actually battling occultists, high level occultists, like Kepler at the end of his the Harmonies of the World. It's this beautiful book, and people can buy it. It's a bit expensive, but it's worth it. And he takes you through exactly what he does to prove the musical proportions of the planets around the solar system, around the star, the sun. He takes you through it, how Plato's hypothesis, and he cites Plato directly from the Timaeus, how that hypothesis of the musical proportions of the creator that generated the harmony of the spheres, how with the new data that had been accrued in the whatever it was 1900 years after Plato dies and Kepler comes into this world, he's like, we have enough now to prove that that's true. And he does it. And again, it's so beautiful, glorious. And then at the very end, there's this chapter where he's attacking Robert Flood. In the epilogue to the Sun. And
Flood
like,
was a hermetic occultist scientist. Is that Robert Flood?
Yeah, that same guy. And he's attacking him by name. And Robert Flood produced his own Harmonies of the World 2 years before Kepler published his, and the name is not a coincidence. And Robert Flood basically has this penis-centric model of the solar system with his character, this naked dude with the whole universe revolving around his penis. And that's part of the...
I've seen the illustrations of that.
Yeah. And, Kepler, being a guy who is making real discoveries, he's very sensitive to the occult fallacies embedded in Robert Flood's system, which is very much based upon sex magic, scrying, other things, numerology. Like he's using a lot of this stuff.
16th century? What century was this?
Yeah, it's 1617. Robert Flood is publishing this, and Flood is part of the British intelligence occult takeover that John Dee earlier was part of, and Francis Bacon also. So they've already been baking and bubbling and boiling away at transforming England into an empire. And it's directly through this occult penetration that subverted the better part of the English traditions. And, all of the authentic Platonists and Augustinians like Thomas More were killed. Cardinal Morton, others were assassinated or exiled and purged like Erasmus. And this other thing was increasingly took over and changed the character of England to make it into the seat of the new Roman Empire, which was always the idea, was to like find a place that was going to be the new throne of the revival of the Roman Empire, that wouldn't make the
Mhm.
mistake of tolerating Christianity this time, but would just like, that's what Edward Gibbons was assigned to come up with a thesis of, like, diagnosing why Rome collapsed. And it was just, if they just tolerated these Christian values too much, and if they just didn't make that mistake and just did a better scorched earth thing, then they would have survived forever, says Gibbons. But Gibbons was working for the British Empire. He was kind of like a bit of a bias, you know. So these occultists, these black magicians were coming in. Robert Flood was the big one at the time. And I'm like, yo, Kepler is directly at war with Robert Flood. And then Leibniz is
Interesting.
directly at war with John Locke directly. And, you know, he's calling out Locke's thesis of the blank slate, which is a revival of the Aristotelian blank slate, that the tabula rasa, in his essays on human understanding. And then, you know, Leibniz is writing his own new essays on human understanding in the form of Platonic dialogue, directly taking aim at the Lockeans, who denied the idea of any pre-existent harmony within, that would allow otherwise for a discovery to be made, or for a society to be organized around the idea that we're all made in the living image of a creator. That would be denied if we're all just the sum total of our fleshly passions. He's also at war with Isaac Newton. You know, you got these Leibniz versus Newton debates. Well, Newton doesn't have a debate. Newton never debates in public because, well, people can theorize to themselves why Newton is never allowed to debate his own ideas in public. But he has a handler who named Samuel Clarke, who's part of the Invisible College, the Rosicrucian, you know, Invisible College that created the Royal Society, that is debating
Mhm.
Leibniz, defending the Newtonian cosmology in opposition to Leibniz's dynamic cosmology. Um, and you're like, this is like a hard battle. Like, it's so intense, and it's completely written out of history. So I'm told that Leibniz stole his. I'm either I'm told that he stole. I've had one teacher who told me he stole his discovery of the calculus from Newton, or that Newton and Leibniz both just discovered the calculus. Except the only one that's actually used in practical astronomy or anything today is the Leibniz calculus notation. Nobody uses the fluxions of Newton. They're not useful. It's only Leibniz. So
Mhm.
it seems like, and then you look at, well, what's Leibniz doing? Well, he's helping to organize philosopher kings. Like he's the privy counselor to Tsar Peter the Great. He's organizing Electress Sophia, who's the next in line to become the Queen of England, to as his student. He was nearly Prime Minister of England. He's organizing John Winthrop
Really?
and writing letters to the colonists. He's writing letters to missionaries in China around bringing in the meritocratic Confucian principles into Europe to revive. He's setting up royal academies of science in France and in Prussia, and it's like, this guy is a geopolitical master player, like a Ben Franklin type, whose scientific work and his political work are not separate. So, and Kepler's also advising generals. He's advising General Wallenstein, who's bad at war in the 30 Years War, and giving him some seriously solid advice on geopolitical battles, which nearly ended the 30 Years War if Wallenstein hadn't made some big mess ups. Um, but so, you know, you've got this conjunction of science and the implications of what it means that every human being, even if you're not from a highborn family, can make a discovery of God's creation to any degree, and then apply that in the form of technological progress that allows for the breaking free of the former limits to growth that we were faced with when we were ignorant of those discoveries. So before you make a discovery, you have limits based on the type of
Mhm.
technological level that you're at that place. But to the degree that the oligarchy is able to monopolize whatever resource you're addicted to, or type of technology or textbook you're addicted to, if they can monopolize metaphysically and physically those systems, they can control diminishing returns and create wars from scarcity and other things. To the degree that
Yeah.
individuals break out of that and produce Da Vinci's that all of a sudden render the old resources obsolete and the old techniques obsolete, because now all of a sudden you've discovered something new that can sustain more people at a higher quality of life with greater productive powers of labor, the oligarchy
Yeah.
loses their control and they have to do all this work to try to like reorganize themselves and subvert the thing again and try to reconquer or like reconquest the new resources. And it's a lot of work.
Mhm.
And so the oligarchy hates that, and that's where I think that they've really been trying to obscure this quality of the mind that can make these leaps and into eurekas.
Totally.
And that's the book. That's book 2, is like all stuff on that and how Tesla plays into that. Nikola Tesla himself plays into that operation.
Dude, what's your take on Giordano Bruno?
I think he was cool. But
Because
I
he
think
was
that
deep into the occult, like more than anybody else, but he also was promoting the heliocentric model of the universe before anyone else, and he got burned at the stake for it, right? Like he literally got burned alive for it. But he was,
yeah,
I mean, he was deep into the occult. But you think he was a good on the good side of history?
he's yeah, I think he was. And look, what I'm getting, I've bought 2 books by Giordano Bruno on creation. I'm trying to see if I can get them off the shelf right now, or I'll get them later. From what I've read so far, he seems pretty awesome. And what I've noticed in reading, like, so you've got a lot of these historical gatekeepers who write the narratives of history that we're supposed to look to the past through those filters that these gatekeepers give us. Arthur Koestler being one, Dame Frances Yates being another big one, who's high up. She herself is high up in the occult, but she wrote things like the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, and she's like a major player. And what I've noticed is that they try to. Have you ever read the book The Rosicrucian Enlightenment?
No, I haven't.
Okay, that's a super influential one. I read that a couple of times now, and what I noticed that she has been assigned to do is co-opt everybody to make everybody seem like they're all part of the Rosicrucian agenda. So like Kepler becomes a Rosicrucian initiate, Leibniz becomes a Rosicrucian initiate. There's no more battle between Robert Flood and Kepler. There's no more battle between Newton and Leibniz. So they just sort of like, if they can't get rid of the name, they try to co-opt it and rebrand it in conformity with what they want. So I'm getting a sense so far that they've done a lot of that to Giordano. I they It seems I got to read more Giordano, like in the context of there appears to be, it's possible that there was like a good hermetic tradition and a good kabbalistic tradition, perhaps. I haven't seen enough representatives of those who are of that good tradition, as far as like those who did the most to break us free of oligarchy and to raise us to something better, who are also Kabbalists and Hermeticists. I just haven't seen enough representatives of that current thus
Mhm.
far. If Giordano is that, I'm open to it. But so far, what I've been reading of his writings has not led me to believe that, though he wasn't a Christian fundy, he just believed in like a creative, active, living God who's present and that we can participate in creation, which was seen as a heresy by a lot of
Yeah.
institutions who were threatened by that idea that had to
He
burn
was
him
chased
upside down.
all throughout Europe. He was exiled from,
Yeah.
I don't know, 3 different countries or something, and then imprisoned and burned at the stake. But I think he's a cool
I
figure
think
in
he's pretty cool
history for
too.
sure.
Yeah, and I think he was like overlapping with some of the better networks in England fighting against this occult takeover, like the Shakespeare Marlowe networks. And Shakespeare and Marlowe, I'm of the view now that they're the same guy. That Shakespeare was Marlowe, but they were exposing a lot of what the oligarchy was up to in a lot of the plays, like The Merchant of Venice and Othello, and even the studies of the Roman histories is really wonderful stuff as far as just getting a sense of the method of the oligarchy and how they get us to destroy ourselves. Um, so it seems like the Bruno networks were active in England around those groups as well. Uh,
Yeah, I don't know his network um, at all, but isn't it interesting how science and the occult have always intermingled? I mean, thousands of years ago, the priests were also the scientists of any society, right? Like it was kind of like the same thing, and they also were the chemists, and I, it's all originating from like the same place. So it makes sense that all of these scientists throughout the last 2,000 years that I know about, most of them were also practicing occultists, like Isaac Newton and Giordano Bruno and Robert Flood. It's like the alchemical tradition kind of, it hasn't
well,
stopped, you know. And Nikola Tesla too was a good example.
yeah. Well, it definitely hasn't stopped, yeah. But I would just add a touch of nuance to that, in the sense that at this point I wouldn't say that Flood or Newton discovered anything, though they are marketed as being scientists. I don't think that they were ever actually scientists. I think they were. It was a propaganda campaign, but they never. All of the discoveries associated with them were stolen from people who made their discoveries before them, and it was simply stolen and repackaged and attributed to them, by satanic groups that wanted to keep us ignorant to the nature of what our minds were capable of doing when they were operating in a when like moral reason was allowed to blossom to its full maturity. We can all make those types of like universal discoveries, and that's what they've been trying to obscure. And I get the sense that with Tesla, there's something similar too, where a lot of propaganda was built up around the image of the man that was not real, and that a lot of the discoveries that were legitimate, because there's two types of discoveries attributed to Tesla, which are the discoveries that they say he made but there's no evidence of. So he would talk a big
Right.
talk like a snake oil salesman about, like, flying electromagnetic flying boxes and stuff, but he would like talk about it, but there was no evidence that he'd ever done anything like that, or like
Uh-huh.
death ray machines that he broke up to save the world by breaking them up and giving
Yeah.
a different part of the death ray to different governments to get them to talk to each
The
other.
the self-generating energy machines that we just don't have. I mean, the story that I was told regarding all this is that the government came in and confiscated all of his research, and then he was killed or died, and so like we'll just never see the light of any of it. And that he was fighting with um, Edison. He was in a battle with Thomas Edison. I don't know. What do you think of like that version of the story?
The more I've looked into it, and Anton Chaikin he's publishing a new book, and he's been sending me his manuscripts, and he's done more work than anybody that I know on Edison, specifically. I've really come to develop a newfound respect for Edison as a patriot, and somebody who is really fighting hard against the oligarchy. Though I know he's been painted as the bad guy in the story, and Tesla's the good guy.
Right.
Most of that has been made up and repeated by just certain press outlets tied to the Hearst printing machine and or publication machine, and different narrative gatekeepers that reproduce and amplify a story that has no actual evidence. Like, for one, there's a story that Tesla made up, and I say made up because I believe he lied, that he quit working for Edison because Edison promised something, I don't know, ridiculous, like $1 million or something, like some crazy big amount of money for some employee that could solve a certain issue in one of the Edison factories, and Tesla did it. He solved the issue. He doesn't even describe what exactly it was in any satisfying detail. And then, as the story goes that he recounted, is that Edison, when he asked for his $1 million paycheck, Edison's like, "Ha ha ha! You don't get him. You don't get what American jokes are, do you?" And he's like, "I quit." And then, it's like nobody would do that. Nobody would actually offer to pay that much money anyway, like to a low level like electrician to solve a problem. Like, that's just doing your job. Um, but again, it becomes like apocryphal. So there's this intention to create a god man out of the myth of Tesla, just like they did for Newton. They created, like, Newton, though he didn't discover anything, and his ideas were plagiarized by Huygens and Bernoulli and Kepler, who had their ideas hollowed out and repackaged, turned into mathematical formulae to be memorized in Newton's Principia Mathematica. And then within 1 year, you had like 23 different printings in different languages all of a sudden just spread out around the world to really just amplify the story that apples just have to fall on your head and you make discoveries, and that no one can, like, it's over the top. But the myth making works over time, and then the living generation of people who actually saw Newton as a man and recognized, because they knew him, how useless and incompetent he was, because he would never be allowed to go in public to debate his own thoughts. He wouldn't ever be. He was very controlled. He was the first, what do you call it, warden Master Warden of the Mint of the Bank of England. He's very high up. He shopped his niece
Wow.
sexually as a prostitute to I'm forgetting his name. Which cabinet minister made him, or the chancellor made him the warden of the Bank of England. But yeah, he was the top controller of the mint of the thing that was the part of the takeover of England, after 1688 and the creation of this private central bank. That was him. So he's a very big political player. And then he dies, and then a few generations go by, and people start believing in the story more and more and more, and he becomes like this god man, And so I think this myth making was already baked in while Tesla was already still alive. And when you start, and this part of my book, what got me on this is I was just so shocked, because I always liked Tesla too. You have to, if you're especially into alternative research. There's just so many Crowleyite occultists in his proximity that he's friends with, interfacing with his whole life, living in 5-star hotels. And yet, I've got this image of him as this underdog, constantly persecuted, never understood in his time, having to dig ditches for a period to just survive. And it's like, yeah, but you're living in New York 5-star hotels for 40 consecutive years. You're like, that doesn't sound like somebody who's getting their ass kicked by life that much. And then you're affiliating yourself with like Crowley's assistant, who's like his best friend, this American journalist.
What?
Yeah, he comes up in the book quite a lot. His name is George Sylvester Virek. And George Sylvester Virek is like one of the biggest promoters of vampirism. I mean, he wrote a number of books on sex magic, not sex magic, but that comes up in his poetry, actually, sex magic a lot. And he runs the Internationalist and the Fatherland newspapers that Crowley is a writer for during World War I. He's the primary occult German agent in America during World War I and World War II. He's put in jail as the official Nazi spokesman in America in 1942 until 1947. He's in jail and he's caught at the heart of this Nazi apparatus in Washington, D.C., with Hamilton Fish II, or the third, the congressman who's like printing Nazi propaganda with taxpayer money out of Washington to send all over America. That's through George Sylvester Virek. Now, Virek, for 25 years, is practically like, he is the best friend of Tesla. They spend time at each other's houses, like a lot of time, too much time. And Tesla's writing poetry there's recorded poetry. The poetry that Tesla wrote is only devoted to one man in this world. It's to George Sylvester Virek. And it's an homage to Newton, which I cite. That was his poem in homage to the the dignity of Newton in opposition to Einstein, who was, he hates Einstein. And he adores Virek. And Virek is working with Crowley, who's operating within the United States in New York during World War I. Together, they're working using Tesla's machine in Long Island to send messages to the German High Command in 1914, 1915, which finally, it seems like there's this guy who wrote a book. I'm just so bad with names right now. It's called Secret Agent 666. That's it right here. Richard Spence. If you could ever interview this guy, he's great. So this book,
I know the name.
Yeah, it's such a useful book, and it's on Aleister Crowley, British intelligence, and the occult. And so these guys are working with Tesla to transmit messages from Washington to Germany. That's giving the Germans intel about the munitions that are going to be on this passenger ship called the Lusitania, that then takes it out of neutral status so that they kill a bunch of people on the ship. And then that's designed to spark outrage, kind of like a 9/11 in the Americans, to get them to want to go to war with the Germans. Right. So yeah, Virek is everywhere. He's a filthy creature. His son becomes a leading co-founder of the neoconservative movement, Peter Virek, very much affiliated with the Trotskyists who are taking over and creating the neocons, the Burnham groupings. A lot of overlap there.
The
So
fuck?
yeah, this is the Tesla, right? Like this is Tesla, the dude, and that's just one point of connection to the occult. There's many, and that's what was getting to me as I was just like doing my research on other things, and I kept on encountering these anomalous, disgusting connections, and also noticing that a lot of people that Tesla is saying that because Tesla is taking credit for a lot of inventions that I know because I've done the work. I know that they were not made by Tesla. Tesla's taking credit for
Hmm.
Wilhelm Röntgen's discovery of X-rays. He's saying that's him who discovered that in
Well,
1898. He's saying he discovered X-rays, but then when he's asked like, and also other things too, he says he's the one who discovered radio waves, or that Marconi says he discovered, but Tesla's like, no, it was me. Marconi stole them. But like when he's pressed to deliver proof of like how did you discover them? Where's the proof that you did it first? His answer was, well, my laboratory burnt down in 1894. And so because my laboratory burnt down, I don't have any of that evidence, but I did it. And then the myth
yeah,
makers go to work and they start promoting the story. And then a couple of generations pass. And now everybody
yeah,
thinks that, yeah, Tesla did that. And it's the same thing for Newton. When Newton was asked, how did you discover those things that you say you discovered in your Principia? Because it's all like encyclopedic descriptions of the universe. How did you make the discovery of gravitation? How did you make the discovery of the inverse square law? How did you make the discovery in optics? Because you don't say how you discovered it. You just say, if you like, you just say, here it is. Here's the mathematical formula. All you need to do is just repeat, right? Like an automaton is repeat and be a good scientist. And when he was pressed, his answer was, well, a dog burnt down my dog Diamond. That was his little like like a little chihuahua. My dog Diamond burnt down my laboratory. It knocked over a candle and all of my papers were burnt up, but I did it. And again, it's a
okay.
garbage story. My dog ate my homework. Like what?
Yep. The lab burnt down. Yeah, the dog ate the homework, and then also the government raided it and took all the files away. And all these
Yeah,
mythologies are super. I mean, I think we just pointed out like five different really tall tales associated with different like really important discoveries: the Nag Hammadi tech story, the apple falling on the head, like all of these mythologies that when I'm looking at them as they're being told to me throughout my life, I'm like, well, that sounds kind of crazy. Like just the concept of Nikola Tesla is always this like History Channel version that the specials that they put on the History Channel that are just completely mythologized when you actually stop to think about how absurd a lot of this is. Or I mean, the way I think you should come back and we should do another episode about Elon Musk and like the technocracy movement, and also I want to get into like how Tesla stuff segues more into the Nazis, um, and the whole like Thule Society, and I mean there's myths surrounding that too. Which recently I was like, I'm gonna dive back into the like Nazi occult stuff, so I started digging a little deeper, and I remember like 15 years ago learning about the Vril Society, and a few months ago went back to look at it, and I discovered that this figure, Maria Orsic, like I don't think she ever existed. This like Braille Society
no,
woman
she did
who
not
is
exist.
promoted. Yeah, I mean, you hear whenever people talk about Nazi occult stuff and the Braille Society, they put this beautiful woman's face on the screen, and they're like, look at all these beautiful women who are working for the Nazis, and we just happen to know nothing about them. And so
Yeah,
when I went to dig deeper about Maria Orsic, that person never fucking existed. And in fact, the picture that's used to represent Maria Orsic is like some random conglomeration of images from like
what?
multiple
Really?
different people. I'm like, who is sitting behind their, I mean, who is creating this stuff and putting it out there for the public to consume as if it's true? And then the
Yeah,
History Channel is like, here you go, you guys, this is real history. Here you go. There's Nazi UFOs, and like they're so powerful and genius. Please
yeah.
revere how powerful and genius all these occult like
Yo,
demigods are. I mean,
you nailed
yeah,
it.
that was my
That's
recent
exactly.
mythology.
Yo, you're totally on point. That's exactly what they've been trying to do, and yeah, I think there's been a concerted effort over the after the entire Cold War to the present to try to make the Nazis appear to be these like
Superhuman, highly
yeah,
technology advanced, like yeah.
yeah. And it's like you can't judge them really because they're interfacing with ascended masters of alien races from another dimension and universe. And so they operate in ways that are beyond you, mere mortal. And so it's kind of a
Right.
weird gateway to rehabilitating the Nazis for sure.
Isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Yeah, the History Channel stuff. Because I remember distinctly. I know you're not an American, but the History Channel. I don't think you guys have the History Channel that we have in the United States. But I distinctly remember a point in the mid 2000s where all of a sudden the History Channel had nothing educational on it at all, like anything at all. It just turned into complete sensationalism, like Nazi UFOs and ancient aliens and pretty much just that, like replayed over and over and over again, that all of Americans are watching.
Yeah.
And there has to be something there as to why that, there has to be like a social engineering angle as to why that
Yeah.
is what they're wanting to popularize.
Yeah. I'd love to know. And I probably should figure this out sooner than later. And if anybody listening to this actually has done the work, please reach out to Bridget and I because this is important. Like, who took over the History Channel and turned it into a UFO propaganda machine? Who did that? Please write to us and give us some leads because I want to know. For sure, though, it's not history anymore. And yeah, if you look at Julius Evola, not hard fascist, never reconstructed, and he became a major influencer of culture and narratives about the Nazis and Vril after World War II. And he's making a big comeback right now, especially around
Yeah.
Dugin circles in Russia and the West who just follow that sort of thing. But they're really, really pushing a Julius Evola pagan fascism sort of traditional weird thing. And it is tied to this, it's infused with this weird, superstitious UFO mysticism as well. And the Vril, yeah, totally. Like that's a big one because the Nazis got a lot of their the most important doctrines that animated the inner core of the Nazis didn't come from Christianity. They hated Christianity. Hitler tried to rewrite the Bible. He did. It was called the Reichsbible, and they had this inner. There's this spin-off grouping around. My wife actually is writing a series on this right now. It's wild. This druidic rune uh, occultist named Guido von List and Lanz von Liebenfels. And they were also working with the German theosophical leader Franz Hartmann to create Ariosophy and the Armanon order. And they had a magazine that a young Hitler was a subscriber to it. And the idea was to take the Ascended Masters, the Rosicrucian stuff, and the root races theology of Blavatsky that we're on the cusp of the sixth root race, and here we are with the highest Teutonic Aryan sort of bloodline being the the last and the best of the root races, and now we're gonna give birth to the
Yeah.
new transhuman thing.
The
So
swastika.
the swastika, and they package that into the German psyche with a focus now on like just completely make believe, totally made up stories about Odinism and the grandeur of the Teutonic purebloods that were subverted by Charlemagne, but they were like the glorious, true essence of Germany that has to be revived. That we can get back in touch with by doing runes that became the foundation of a lot of the symbology of the Nazi SS. Himmler was big into this, but it wasn't even that it came from the Theosophists, but also that the Theosophists got a lot of this. Blavatsky and Olcott got a lot of this material from the I think the higher controlling hand of the followers of Bulwer Lytton. Um, Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton was a high level of high like was closely allied with um Alphonse Levy
Mm.
what's his name?
Eliphas Levi.
Alphonse
Yeah.
Levy. What's his name again?
Well, I pronounce it Eliphas Levi, which is probably
Eliphas Levy. Yeah.
yeah the
They were
American
together.
pronunciation.
I don't know either, but Eliphas Levy, it's French, but um, they were together ushering in the occult revival that really took big form after the U.S. Civil War, and he wrote a book on the coming race, introducing the Vril Society of the Hollow Earth. That it's in a
Yeah, the
fictional
Hollow Earth.
novel, yeah. And
Yes.
in this society, you got these American explorers who stumble upon this cavernous system that takes them down into this Atlantean race of superhumans
Mhm.
that communicate telepathically and that have these robotic droids that they can control directly by mind power using this very ephemeral etheric fluid called Virilia. And
Yeah.
because they're such pure bloods, only they can do it. So it's very much tied
Right.
to the power of mind in your blood. Uh,
That's actually
and
where Hitler is right now, because when he lost the war, he fled to Hollow Earth. Is what
yes,
people
preparing his
say.
takeover. Yeah. What was that movie? That series of movies, Iron Dome or something, or uh,
I don't know. I don't watch
it's like the
movies.
Nazis that have been like in the Hollow Earth for the last 80 years with the dinosaurs ready to take back control of the world. It's an entertaining series of movies, but some people actually believe that, right? Um, yeah, and that's what the Nazis were doing in Antarctica. They were actually trying to find, or in Tibet, they were not just trying to find in Tibet the root of the Aryans, but they were also trying to find these mythical caverns into the underground kingdom of Shambhala, where the ascended
Is that like
masters.
Hyperborea? I see these pagan Nazis on Twitter always talking about Hyperborean yada yada
Hyperborea
mythical
was like,
worlds.
I think, the first or second root race. There's been like in Blavatsky's cosmology, there's like 7 total races, of which there's like subdivisions within each one. It's all made up. Like there's no basis for any of this. And like Hyperborea was, I think, the first or second one, I think,
Okay.
where these partially disembodied entities evolved in the Arctic or something that then
Okay.
seeded Lemuria.
Oh yeah,
I
that's where
might be
the
mis.
white hair, blue eyes comes from.
Yes.
Lemur, the Pleiadian. I don't know. They've got a lot of different theories going on too. That's the other thing about these people is that they just they just spew just random shit. I mean, the words sound cool. Lemuria, uh,
You know,
Pleiades, Hyperborea. Like it sounds really mystical, but it's like just make up your minds, you guys. There's no consensus on any of this either.
no, it's n'importe quoi, but as they say in French. But it's, you know where they got the name Lemuria from?
Where
Be,
lemurs?
yeah, lemurs, exactly. So the logic was because there are lemurs in like New Zealand or whatever, and there's lemurs in some part of Indonesia. They're like, there must have been a land bridge connecting the two, and we'll say that that land bridge is this mythical continent that sunk, and we'll call it Lemuria. And
No
this is,
way.
yeah, somebody just came up with this in the 1820s, and then Blavatsky's like, yeah, and that continent was the seed of the Lemurian race, and she just built the whole thing onto that. And then the Lemurians had one of their last root races that gave rise to the race of giant Atlanteans that had their own root race in this mythical lost continent of
Oh my
Atlantis. And then they were the giants, the Nephilim, as has been spun by creative writers, to then generate the race of sort of men today that have more primitive, like, Jews and dark skinned Africans, and they're like more primitive members of the root race that should go extinct, right? To be
Yeah, the
scientific.
pygmies and stuff.
The
Yeah.
pygmies, and then and Blavatsky was so racist. Like she really thought these people really were like spiritually inferior, and thus by necessity had to go extinct somehow. However that happens, whatever. But
Oh
and
my
then the
god.
the Teutonics were like the highest. of the root races that conveniently were tied to what the Merovingians believed, that they were the root race from, that they were the babies of Jesus and Mary Magdalene and had the starseed blood or whatever. And, and this is where you get the Viking
Yeah.
stuff. So a lot of the Viking marcher lords that were being deployed to cause havoc in the ancient world, after Rome collapsed, they were largely like ISIS groups are today, that were used and deployed to destabilize rival governments, rival societies, or create wars by rape and pillage and everything else, whether it was the Northman invasion into England or to Italy, which both happened around the same time to prep the groundwork for the Crusades. But the Vikings were everywhere. That's the Norman invasion. Like the Bulwer Lytton, the Bulwers and the Lyttons got power through the Norman invasion, both sides of the family. And thus they were just Northmen, Vikings, which had their own like human sacrifice. Not that all Vikings are the same thing. There are many different sects, and some were maybe better than others, but a lot of them maintain this myth that they're all the progeny of Jesus. And a lot of them, that's, I think, how King Henry VIII was convinced to make his own church with him at the head of the church was, you don't just do that to get a divorce. You do that because you're convinced that you have the authority of God in your blood to become the head of the Anglican Church. Yeah. So anyway, it's messed up.
God.
Yeah.
Dude, well, I have to wrap this up because my friend who's taking care of my baby, I have to let her go home. But are you willing to come back in the next couple weeks, so we can continue this? Because I feel like I have a lot more I have to ask you, going into the science of eugenics, the Nazis, like all that pathway. Does that sound good?
Yeah, it sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay. And for the people listening, how can they find you and follow your work?
CanadianPatriot.org. All the books are there. RiseandTideFoundation.net. That's the classes and cultural stuff. Substack as well. I put out things almost every day on Substack, mostly free.
Sweet. I'll link that below so people can find it super easily. And with that, I hope you guys enjoy listening to this. I know it's a lot and a lot of words that most people aren't really familiar with, but if you need any help understanding, if one thing that I'm sure, Matt, you've delved into Manly P. Hall and his work. There's a book that he wrote called The Secret Teachings of All Ages, which is like an encyclopedia of occult history and knowledge. And it's like chapter by chapter, each section is about a different huge topic. Yeah, there you go.
Huge.
And that is like, that's a really good starting point for understanding anything that we just mentioned in this episode, because we're jumping timelines, we're jumping ideologies, but Manly Hall covers most of it. So if you want to know what the hell we were just talking about, check out Matt's books and also check out that book, and that should help. But other than that, Matt, it was a pleasure having you as always, and I'll have you back on very soon.
Cool. All right. Till next time. Bye.
All right.